Hello, my name is Vasilios Kosmakos. I'm here with my coworker Adolfho Romero. Today is March 16th, 2022. Who would have the pleasure with us speaking with today?
My name is Don DeMaria. I live on Summerland Key.
Fantastic. And if you can kind of just tell us a little bit about who you are, kind of what you do, that type of thing.
Um, Mainly commercial fish. I've been here since 1977, but I do a little bit of help with some research work too. I worked for 22 years with a group that collects marine invertebrates. So I got to travel all around, dive from Alaska to South Africa and all through the Western Pacific. So I got to see a lot of other areas, and there's pristine reefs, what a coral reef should look like. And the Keys are far from healthy.
So if you can kind of just tell us a little bit about, so we interviewed your daughter from Reef Relief. She mentioned that you were a fisherman turned conservationist. If you can kind of just tell us a little bit about that journey and kind of, what kind of led you to that kind of role.
I'm having trouble understanding it. What was that question again?
We interviewed your daughter, and she had mentioned
Right.
that you were a fisherman turned conservationist. How did that describe that journey for us? So, what made you make that transition?
Well, I think I've always been a bit of a conservationist, but as things wind down, it gets more obvious that we got problems here. But I commercial fished for years and just kind of saw things winding down. We were catching fish much faster than they can be replenished, and that concerned me.
I have a question. How was it back in the 1970s versus how it is now? What difference have you seen in fish production or,
The water was a lot clearer. The reef was a lot healthier. There were a lot more fish, and they were bigger. And I remember when I first came here in 77, I talked to some of the old fishermen on the docks, and they would say, well, you should have seen it in the 40s and 50s. And I had trouble, believing it could have been any better than what I was seeing in the 70s. Now I find myself telling the young people to work with me what it was like in the 70s and 80s, and I could see they really don't believe it. But after a few years of them diving and seeing it, they see it change. So I think people are waking up to it, but not enough people, not the right people.
So, kind of elaborate a little bit more on that. In terms of changes, what exactly have you been seeing in terms of species composition, in terms of habitat loss? What exactly has been the most striking difference?
But the water quality is a big one. At the TDC, the Tourist Development Council, used to advertise the Keys as having crystal clear cobalt blue water. Now they advertise it as the emerald green waters of the Florida Keys, but it's really just, algae blooms they're talking about, trying to cover it. It's a pretty color, but it shouldn't be green. The reefs had a lot more coral cover, especially elkhorn, staghorn back then. And it's just, it's a world of difference between 77 and today. I can only imagine what it was like in the 40s.
right, right. One thing that we hear is a lot of divers, they don't even want to go in anymore inside the water because it makes them really upset, after what it used to be back in the 80s, even
Yeah.
early 90s. Not a lot of people want to, now they go in 2021 and they're like, this is not the reefs that we used to see back in the day.
No, it's not. It's like watching a dear friend die a slow, horrible death. Just slow. Every
Wow.
year it gets worse and worse. It doesn't seem to be anybody that's really got a handle on it. The sanctuary certainly does not. Uh, FWC definitely doesn't. So I don't know
So,
what to do about it.
so you mentioned you were a commercial fisherman. Just, explain the difference between that and a charter captain, a recreational fisherman, etc.
Well, so I still commercial fish. I dive for specimens for research and the tropical fish trade. I got rid of all my other snapper grouper permits and whatnot because that's a fishery of the past. But I mean, I still fish. It's just not at the level that I did before. And it's a little bit different. Most most of the stuff we collect now, there's probably more of it now than ever before. I know you hear fishermen say that, but the stuff we collect, like emerald crabs and turbo snails, are algae eaters. So there's more algae now, and I think there's more of them. an indication that the reef's good. There's so many of them. I think it's indication of poor water quality when you have a thriving community that it just feeds on algae. All the top predators are pretty much gone.
So that's interesting change in composition. So you're catching more algae eaters, so things that are lower on the trophic level, as opposed to things that are like
Yes.
sharks or groupers, etc.
Yes.
Because there's more algae. You know, describe, elaborate on that a little bit more. So what exactly are you catching? Talk about the invertebrates specifically.
Most of the stuff we collect mainly just these little, they're called turbinella snails. And you're allowed a gallon. For us, it's a gallon per person per day, to 2 gallons maximum. That's about 2,000 snails at the very most, 10 cents a piece. And emerald crabs were allowed 400 a day at 60 cents. So they're not huge money makers, and there's pretty strict limits. It was a marine life rule that we helped put in place years ago, and I think it's doing well. But the bottom line is the stuff that's really doing well is the stuff that thrives in a declining system, like the emeralds and the turbos. The other stuff, the snapper groupers, all that stuff is not doing so well.
So elaborate a little bit more on the commercial value, though, that you just mentioned about the turbella snails and the emerald crabs. You said you mentioned the price point that they go for. I mean, do people eat them, or what's the commercial use for them?
Well, for the aquarium trade.
Okay.
Yeah, strictly for the aquarium trade.
Oh, wow.
And there's even tropical fish people that sell algae, different types of algae.
Interesting.
So it's for that particular segment of the fishery, it's the declining ecosystem hasn't been a bad thing for just particular items like that. Now the angelfish and all that is a different story, fish, but for the algae eaters, it hasn't been a bad thing for the tropical fish guys.
So discuss that habitat then, right? So the bottom is covered in algae, the seagrass is gone, a lot of this kind of major kind of habitat is degraded. How has that changed the species composition? So a lot more herbivores. Has the environment changed at all? I mean, has the function of it changed? I mean, discuss that.
Yeah, I think it's fish that are items that are very low on the trophic level. The seagrass is covered with algae now, which kills the grass, but the turbo snails thrive on that. So yeah, it's I think even the species composition has changed here.
And then in terms of a lot of the kind of bony, in terms of a lot of the commercial fish that you mentioned, the groupers, the bonefish, the tarpon, etc., kind of give us an idea about how over time you've kind of seen those things decline. So was it a really fast drop off? Was it a really steady decline? I mean, when was the point in time you kind of noticed, wow, things are getting bad?
It seemed like things really started to go downhill in the mid 1980s. That's when the sea urchins, the long-spined sea urchins, started to die off. Some say it was a virus that came through the Panama Canal, maybe in ballast water, but it didn't come through the canal because there's that big freshwater lake it would have to go through. But that seemed to be when things started to make a turn, when the sea urchins started dying off. But even the fish that have no commercial value, like and they're off limits to commercial fishing, like bonefish, tarpon, are not doing real well. So you really can't point a finger at commercial fishing for that. That's probably a water quality thing.
And you mentioned the 80s, right? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the 80s, right? You kind of started seeing the most precipitous kind of decline, and you kind of mentioned the sea urchins as being an indicator of that. What do you think caused that? I mean, what was kind of what was the impetus for that?
Well, the people that know a lot more about it than I do claim it was a virus of some sort, how it got into the Caribbean, because it was Caribbean wide, it wasn't just in the Keys. But that seemed to be the trigger that set everything else off. Or maybe it's just something to relate the time to. But I remember diving west of Key West and seeing him actually dissolving and dying in the mid 80s. And that seemed to be when everything started to go downhill after that. Of course, Florida, its population's picked up a lot since then. And maybe it's just a combination of things. I don't think you're going to cram as many people in South Florida, along with agriculture and cattle and whatnot, and have pristine conditions. It's probably not going to happen. It'd be better than what it is, but it's not going to be pristine again.
So kind of based upon what you just said, then, right? Talk about the influence of nutrients in the water column and the connection with algae. So algae is covering the bottom, nutrients cause algae to grow. Was there a specific time you kind of saw more? You started noticing more and more algae. When was that period?
It was the 80s, the mid 80s, because the long spine sea urchins kept the reef clean. They ate that. But I remember years ago, in the late 80s, in the mid-late 80s, the mid-80s, when we used to dive up the coast, you could dive close to shore around Venice and Fort Myers in that area in the dry season, in the spring. Once the rain started and everything started flowing off land, the water turned green. Visibility went bad. So, to me, that's a pretty strong indication something's coming off the land.
When this occurred, would fishermen, captains, and so forth, would they talk about it, try to organize themselves? Like, what do we do about this issue? Or every man for themselves and just figure out a new route, new place to go and fish? Or what happened?
Fishermen really aren't too good about environmental causes like that. They just sort of go from one fishery to the next, but they didn't really do much about it, sadly. And they're still not really too involved today. We're trying to get some involved with the shallow sewage injection wells on Marathon, and really haven't had any help from the organized groups yet. It's a serious problem. It's an injection well. The sewage is only going to like 60 feet, and it bubbles, comes right back up and into the nearshore waters. We even did some water samples out there, and it showed real high levels of sucralose, which only gets in the water through artificial sweeteners. And still, we can't get the commercial fishermen on board. They complain about water quality, but they really don't. They don't really take a stand and don't really do anything.
And why do you think that is? Because there is a very direct connection between water quality and money in their pocket. Why don't you think they're more aggressive about kind of solving those issues?
I think it's a lot of short-sighted stuff with fishermen. A lot of them are old, and they realize they're going to be retiring soon. Even if they do clean up the water, by the time it gets cleaned up, they're going to be retired or passed on. And I think it's a lot of it is just get what you can while you can and get out. That's the attitude of a lot of them, I believe.
And how do we go about kind of mitigating the issue? Is it a gap in education? Is it simply just ignorance? How do we get people to care? Especially, if it affects their pocket.
How do I what?
How do we get people to care about these issues? How do we get these
fishermen? I don't know. I really don't know. We've tried over the years, but it's just not a lot of them really don't get involved unless it directly impacts them today. I don't know how to get them involved.
Oh yeah, I think you're bringing good points about like caring for the land, caring for the waters, especially now in 2021. With everything coming in with climate change, it's bringing a little bit more awareness into people's radar. But I think at the end of the day, it's like, how does that? I guess kind of difficult for people to see. At the end of the day, they eat the fish. They don't understand the process, maybe perhaps how it goes from catching the fish, getting the fish all the way into the store, however it is, whatever it may be. But the only thing they see is the wrap in the paper. Here you go. This is your fish. They don't know. They're not connected to that source of food where it's coming from. So, as long as they see it on their shelves, I don't know. Maybe that might be a reason that we need to reconnect folks to the way of where is this food coming from and how they're getting it to the stores, to their plate eventually.
Yeah, might not want to do that in the Keys, since there's so few fish around now. Most of it's imported. The people really want to know they're eating imported fish when it's being advertised as fresh, locally caught seafood. Probably not. So, I don't know. The Keys just doesn't produce that much anymore in the way of fish. Some lobster and some stone crab, high price items, but not a whole lot of fish anymore.
And where are these fish coming from? The ones that are being imported.
A lot of it comes from Mexico. Some comes from Vietnam. It comes from a lot of other different places.
I mean,
Lots.
and it's interesting because you mentioned this, you mentioned a decline in our fisheries is now putting pressure on the fisheries in these developing countries, right? In Mexico and Vietnam,
Yeah.
which they have less regulation than we do, right? So, I mean, that's putting an immense amount of pressure on theirs. So it's kind of really like passing the buck, right? It's like from our issue to their, and we're making our issue their issue now. I mean, it's kind of a hard problem to solve, isn't it?
It's real hard. We'll eat up everything we have here, and then we'll go pay people a lot more money and eat up their fish too. Basically, what's happening.
Do you think there's a way to sort of maybe not grab fish from the ocean, but maybe even raise or breed our own fish at that point, leave the oceans for a while, and just sort of like create our own fisheries inland? I don't know. Would that be an option or?
Well, I'm sure there's people trying to do it. There's a big operation that's trying to raise salmon in Homestead, Florida, Miami. It's at it's called Blue something or other, Blue Sapphire. It's some Norwegian company. I believe they're putting $200 million into it, but I don't think it's got off the ground yet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's people trying. I don't know how well it's going to do.
So discuss a little bit more about your role, I mean, with the pet trade stuff. So, I mean, you kind of know, so you mentioned how these turbella snails and these emerald crabs are being used in the pet trade. What makes those species so attractive?
What makes them what?
So attractive in the pet trade.
That they do good in aquariums. They keep aquariums clean. They eat algae. So that's the main selling point for them.
And do you, what connection do you make between the aquarium trade and any environmental degradation that's happening? Are fish stocks declining because of it? I mean, kind of elaborate on that a little bit.
I think there's some things that you can, the aquarium trade is responsible for, like possibly Condylactus anemones. They may have been over harvested. They're closed now, and a few other things. But for the most part, that's one of the few well-managed fisheries around, I believe. So.
Yeah, now I kind of feel bad. I do have a couple of aquariums back at home, 75 gallon, so forth. But yeah, it's one of those things that, like I like looking at them and all this, but like thinking in the great scheme of things, where are these fish coming from, And that makes me think, like, what is the purpose at the end of the day of me having them? Just to look pretty, to sit there, or, to return back to the wild, maybe reproduce and send them back out into the wild?
I don't know. The aquarium fish from Florida are managed fairly well. The angelfish, like queen angels, for instance, you can only catch them between 1 3/4 inches and 8 inches. So by the time they get to 8 inches or so, breeder fish are completely protected. So it's a pretty good rule, the marine life rule in Florida. It could be used as a model for other countries too. But some of the way they collect in the Pacific, I mean, I saw it in Indonesia with the floating pens and the 55-gallon drums of sodium cyanide. That's not a smart way. That's not a sustainable way of harvesting fish. These are food fish they were collecting. They do it with aquarium fish too.
Wow.
There's ways to doing all this stuff the right way. You just gotta come up with the right rules, and hopefully people will follow them, which a lot of them don't.
So
That's true with everything.
What are some of the wrong ways, quote unquote, that you're kind of seeing what are some of the wrong practices you've kind of seen, in Florida that maybe should be changed?
Things that should be changed.
Yeah, what are some of the wrong practices, or what are some practices you think are wrong that need to be changed?
Well, the way we dispose of our sewage is one thing. Look at Indian River and all the leaky septic tanks. Well, they're designed to leak. They're supposed to leak. That needs to be changed. And the keys to these shallow injection wells need to go. That's ridiculous. You know. And I think the big thing is the way the FWC, the commission, is appointed. It's mainly there's 7 commissioners. They're mainly developers. I mean, come on, these are the guys that got Florida in the situation it's in to begin with, and they're going to lead us in conservation. It's ridiculous. There should be some fishermen on there and some biologists, but fishermen and biologists generally don't contribute heavily to a governor's campaign, so they don't get on there. Yeah, having a commission stacked with developers is a joke. We got one that's supposed to be our representative from the Keys, Spotswood. He's a huge developer. He's the one that's leading the charge to have Goliath Grouper reopened. He doesn't understand biology at all. He just wants to kill things. The same with the representative from Miami, Barreto. They could care less about the health of the fish. It's, their attitude is no one saved any buffalo for me. Years ago, the attitude of the FWC was save some for tomorrow, but that's not the way it is today. Maybe we get a new governor, they'll appoint some different ones, but the way it is now, I don't think there's much hope for Florida.
Does everybody that serves on the FWC board, that's not an elected position, you're saying? That's someone that's in position?
No, they're appointed by the governor.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know that.
So if you want to get on the board, you contribute heavily to the governor's campaign fund. No, it's serious. That's how it works.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned Goliath Grouper. That's actually specifically why I wanted to talk to you about it. So kind of give me your thoughts about kind of that decision that's been made. It's kind of a controversial one. Some are saying no. Some of the fishermen are saying yes. What are your personal thoughts on it?
On the Goliath Grouper?
Yeah, on the Goliath Grouper.
I think it's one of those fish. Probably the only way to have a sustainable yield on it is to close it completely, like sea turtles and conch. And then whatever your illegal take is, your discard, your bycatch mortality, whatever, that's your maximum sustainable yield at best. And people are still taking turtles, they're still taking conchs. Those things they're barely hanging on. And the Goliath is the same way. People are still killing them. And it's sad with them because there's so much misinformation. They think that the big ones are eating all the fish on the reef, which does not happen. If that was the case, back in the 40s and 50s, there were many more Goliath grouper. There were also many more snapper and grouper, and they were bigger. So how do you explain that? There was a lot more lobster. But these guys, they don't want to listen to the truth. They just want to kill something big. And I don't think there's any way. The number of people in Florida and the electronics we have now, there's no way to have a sustainable harvest on that. Other than, you could probably have a sustainable harvest of manatees and maybe one a year, but what's the point? You do the same thing with Goliaths too. But what they're proposing now is ridiculous. It started out as 100 fish, and the tag was going to be $500. Now it's down up to 200 fish, and the price is $150. So you can see where it's going. Pretty soon it's going to be, and the slot size at 24 to 36 inches. Pretty soon it'll be, $50 a tag, and it'll be up to 5 feet long or something. They just want to get their foot in the door.
So Goliath Grouper is edible. Or at least not conventionally. What's the purpose of opening up that season? Is it just
it's definitely edible. It's a good eating fish. People just think because it's big, it's not good, and it's got worms and stuff. It's got some parasites in it, but it's always been a delicacy in Key West. Always up the coast, not so much. But they just, they've killed everything else off down here. We've caught everything else, snapper and grouper. So need to start in on the Goliaths again, I guess.
Wow.
Even amberjack are gone. And those things used to be a problem. They were everywhere. You could hardly fish because of it. Now they developed a market for that, and You hardly see them anymore. If you do see them, they're small.
Yeah, amberjack specifically. I mean, that's a tough fish. I mean, it's like they they're good fighters. Number one, but number two, it's like I mean, not necessarily the one you want, right? I mean, in terms of
It's
taste.
not a high quality fish, but still, when you have nothing else and most everything else is imported, it's one of the few fresh local caught fish.
Yeah, I wanted to know why is Goliath grouper very important? What is and specifically in the Key West area and the Keys overall? What makes it special?
It was always a local delicacy here with the conchs, cut up thin and fried. It was they've always eaten it, but up the coast when there were plenty of gag grouper and red snapper in the Gulf, nobody even messed with the Goliath grouper. If they caught them, they just cut them loose and let them drift off. They didn't get enough money for them, so it wasn't worth taking up the ice space and the ice for them. But as the red snapper and the gag grouper got fewer, they started catching them. And now they're towards the end of when it was open and closed in 1990, towards the end there, you could sell them anywhere then.
So it's really interesting. You know, we've talked to a lot of different fishermen as part of this project, and you know, a lot of the fishermen we've kind of talked to have been very, they've kind of promoted sustainable fishing practices. I mean, they've kind of talked about this, about all this stuff, but now you're kind of discussing this idea that maybe the fishermen are doing something that's in the best interest of the species in this case. Why discuss that dynamic a little bit?
Again, I couldn't really understand what you were saying.
So, throughout this project, we've talked to a lot of different fishermen who seem to be who seem to promote sustainable fishing practices, who are very keen about protecting the resource, etc. But in the specific case of Goliath grouper, there does seem to be a bit of a headbutting between scientists and fishermen. Yeah. Why do you think that's happening in this case?
Well, I think there's a lot of the misinformation that they're eating everything. They go out to their favorite fishing holes and they don't see any fish on them, and they can't believe that they caught all the fish. They got to blame it on the Goliath grouper. They really think these fish are just vacuuming the bottom out. And, we've changed the environment out there. We put a lot of artificial reefs out, which naturally attract fish like Goliath grouper. And this is where these guys go to fish. There are a lot of them aren't very skilled fishermen. They don't know other areas to go, so they go to these high-profile areas, and all they catch are Goliaths. And they wonder why. Well, two reasons: they like the wrecks, and they've caught everything else out of the wrecks. Just the way it is. And they look at the Goliath as competition. When it's not like that at all. We used to fish in the Gulf. Once in a while, we'd find a wreck that nobody had hit. It would be loaded with Goliath grouper and gag and red grouper and lots of snapper, all sizes of snapper. So if the Goliath is really eating them on these unfished spots, you'd expect to see the same thing, very few groupers and snappers of any size. But it's not the way it works. Even Walt Stearns, when he worked for the aquarium in Miami, one of his jobs was to get in the tank and feed the fish. And they had several big Goliaths in there. And I said, Walt, they have other fish in with the Goliaths? He goes, oh yeah, we had angelfish, jack. I said, well, they didn't eat them all? He goes, no. In a natural condition like that, if you wounded one, they'd eat it, certainly. But that's what these fishermen see. They're pulling a fish in that's struggling, and the Goliath takes it. Therefore, the Goliath must eat grouper and snapper because it took one off my line, which is like saying I fed my house cat venison and it ate it. Therefore, house cats eat deer, which is not, it's the same logic. Sure, they're an opportunistic feeder, but they generally don't eat that stuff. There's been so many studies done on stomach contents. I've been part of them. They eat fish that are slow moving and just depend on spines for defense, like shamefaced crabs. They eat lobsters. They like saltwater catfish, stingrays. I don't think I ever caught one and cleaned it and had a snapper or grouper in its stomach. If it did, it had a fishing line in its mouth. where it was struggling and taking off, but it's just not something to eat. Chris Koenig even did he did some type of isotope studies on the stomach content and found out that everything they were eating was way down on the trophic level, like crabs and shrimp, and things like that. I mean, what more do they need? There's been hundreds and hundreds of these fish sampled their stomach contents. You catch them, stick a hose in, you pump out their stomachs, and you sample the contents. I don't know what else these guys need to hear, but they're just not going to believe it. They see it with their own eyes, a Goliath taking a fish off their line, therefore Goliath Grouper are bad.
And you mentioned a name, Chris Koenig. Who is that?
He's a scientist up in the Panhandle, PhD. Him and his wife did most of the work on Goliath Grouper. They're probably without a doubt, the world's experts.
Oh, wow.
Felicia, his wife, ran the FSU Marine Lab. Chris did a lot of the work. He just had a 151-page his final report on Goliath Grouper. And the FWC never even asked them about Goliath Grouper when they come up with this plan. They're right there in their backyard, Tallahassee. They never even called either one of them. And they should have called them to come in and give a presentation or something, but they didn't. And when Chris came on his own dime to these meetings, he got 3 minutes to talk just like everybody else. Now, how are you going to condense 30 years of research into 3 minutes? It's absurd. The FWC does not want, they don't want to be confused with the facts when it comes to this issue.
So from what it seems like, there definitely needs to be a lot more collaboration between these different stakeholders, the fishermen, the politicians, the commissioners, the scientists. I mean, it's like, there needs to be a lot more collaboration, if not, less systematic oppression from what it seems like, of kind of what's been going on.
Yeah, it'd be nice if there's some collaboration. There has been some between fishermen and scientists, and commercial fishermen. The recreational guys help some, but this issue here, it's just astounding the way FWC went about doing it. They picked up the reef data that this guy Scripps has, Dr. Dan Greenberg. He was managing that data. It's visual accounts on the reef. And the staff actually presented at the meeting the reef data and said it showed an increase in the number of fish. And the Scripps scientist, Dan Greenberg, called up and said, no, that's not what our science shows, not at all. And he presented them with the graphs and whatnot, and they just eliminated that from any further discussion. What they did is pick out one spike in the data and say, see, it shows that they're increasing. When you know how it goes up and down, but long term it's down. It's unbelievable that they would do that. But
yeah, right now I was before giving this Zoom call right now, we were actually doing some research on the site, and a lot of the research said like in the early 2000s the Goliath was almost extinct, and then by like 2014 it became on the vulnerable spectrum, so it's not anymore extinct but vulnerable. But nonetheless, we're talking here in the way that you're mentioning, like they cherry pick maybe those studies too.
That's what they did.
And that's a big problem because, if you're just a regular person trying to understand the issue and, just diving in simple search, it comes out the other way. And then it makes us feel like, oh, it's not such a terrible thing then. Everything's getting better. But reality is otherwise. And
the reality, in 2009, 2010, that cold front that came through the Everglades, cold water event, it killed something in the order of 90-something% of the juveniles, age 1 through 5. So it really beat them down almost to nothing. So since then, they've recovered a little bit, but anything from zero, it's an improvement. It's nothing like what it was before the cold water thing. So they're not saying that. And the adults were doing good up until about, not good, but you could see them increasing up until about, 8 years or so ago. It's different in different areas. But then it just started dropping off by all accounts, people that I know. And I think a lot of that is bycatch from commercial fishermen And this catch and release thing with the recreational guys really started, and that takes a toll. Just because it's closed and catch and release only doesn't mean fish mortality is zero. And it's far from zero. They kill a lot of fish. The ones they catch in deep water, their stomachs out of their mouth, their eyes out. Those fish don't make it. You can stick a knife in them and they'll go to the bottom, but that's, most of them are not going to make it. Walt Stearns has photos of some of them off Jupiter with big monofilament line hanging out of their mouth, their gut hooked. They're not going to live. A lot of them are missing an eye, or their eyes have bulged out, they've healed, but there's no eye there. They've only got one eye. Now the ones that lost both eyes obviously die. But yeah, it's taking its toll. And that's one thing that doesn't seem to be, they're not taking that into account.
Goliath groupers have relatively speaking, they kind of have a long gestation period. I think it's like 6 or 7 years.
Yes.
So it really doesn't seem like that kind of basic fact isn't getting taken into account when they're making these policy decisions. 2008, it's roughly 15 years ago. It's like, so that's 2 generations of groupers. That's really nothing.
No, it's not. Well, the Goliaths, they spend the first 5 years of their life in the mangroves. Age 1 through 5 are considered juveniles. They don't migrate out until they're 5 years old or so. The big fish are gone. These fish used to get to be 600 or 800 pounds, but those fish were gone by the time I started in 1972. They were gone. I've never seen one that big. Biggest one we ever got was 450 pounds, and we weighed every single one of them, so I know what they weighed. So it's just, it's, in order for something to be recovered, then you really need the full range of sizes, full range of ages. And the older ones are just not here. It's still young fish, even though they're pretty big. So saying that they're going to open it up to do information for a stock assessment, you really need to have those big old fish to do a good stock assessment. They're not going to have it. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, you brought a really good point about catch and release, and as the sport, we talk to different folks, fishermen and so forth. It's a sport that a lot of fishermen do, and it's something that's big in the Keys. But I guess my point here is, can you expand a little bit more on the impacts of that? Because I honestly did not think about it the way that you were mentioning. Like, it actually goes inside their eyeballs, could pull out an eyeball and so forth. The stress that it creates on the fish themselves. So why do we keep doing it? Why is this still going on? It's still not a good, it still impacts wildlife to a degree.
Sport fishing crowd is powerful in Florida, and they want to catch these big fish. Well, the guys that catch them back in the glades, the small ones in 5 and 6 feet of water, they don't have the barotrauma issue. And you can do circle hooks and have moderate success. Some of them are going to swallow them. When I did some work with Chris Koenig in the glades, catching the juveniles, once in a while, one would swallow a circle hook and it would die. So it's not still, mortality is not zero. But these big ones are catching these 200 and 300 pounders out of 100 feet of water. Most of those fish are dying. They're not going to survive that trip to the surface. The only way to really to decompress these fish is how you do tropical fish. You have to do it in the water as you're coming up about 30 feet when their bladder starts to expand. You have to needle them there and let the gas out. Once they hit the surface and their eyes are bugged out, they don't make it. They may live for a little while, but they die soon afterwards. And none of these recreational guys are going to get in the water at 30 feet and decompress a 300-pound Goliath grouper. They're not going to do it. Make it happen.
So I think you bring up a phenomenal point about the kind of mortality rates about catch and release, because in practice, right, you catch a fish, you throw it back, right, everything's good. But but like you're saying, right, it's like that's unusually the case. Just because you catch a fish and throw it back, it doesn't mean it's going to live, right? And there's going to be some issues it suffers. So discuss that point more generally. So discuss the issues with the whole catch and release dynamic.
We tried catching some deep water snappers in St. Thomas for the aquarium down there, and we'd bring them up, and some of them, their air bladder would rupture on the way up, and we could put them in the tank on the boat, and they would look good. Look good. Every one of them that they put in their aquarium system in St. Thomas eventually died soon afterwards. They'll live for a while, but they'll die. When you stress something that much, and it's it's ripping their insides apart. When their air bladder expands like that, they're not going to make it. Even I know in the aquarium trade with Cuban hogs that you catch in 100, 110 feet of water, if you don't needle them, vent their air bladder on the way up, they don't make it. You could do it on the boat and they'll look okay for a while, but they die.
But
it's just the way it is.
But there are tools though. I forget what specifically they're called. That when you do take a fish, you bring it to the boat. You stick it in, right? It kind of it inflates the thing. I forget what it's called. But are those effective at all, or not really?
Those are a joke. In shallow water, something like that will work. But in deep water, by the time the fish hits the surface, the damage is done. If its eyes are bugged out, they're not just going to go back in and have normal vision. That's for sure. It's a joke.
At this point, do we have a technique that for deep fishing that could be potentially used? And how can we go about this, I guess, in a more sustainable, safe way, or it's just not possible when we're talking about deep fishing and,
it's not possible with deep fish.
It's just not possible.
Unless they want to get in the water and vent them on the way up. Chris and I did that, and that seemed to work. But you're not going to pull a fish on the boat with the stomach sticking out of its mouth, its eyes bulge out, and stick a knife in its side and expect it to live.
So at this point, what we could do is probably focus maybe regulations for deep sea catch and release, and that maybe that's one thing in the future that could happen. But what's left over in the shallows? Well, not in the shallows, but in the front. Where else can you really fish, right? At that point, catch and release when you're having these tournaments.
Do they really have to have Goliath Grouper in tournaments? Can't they just leave one fish aside for the diving community to look at? They have to stick a hook in everything that's out there. Look at what the recreational guys got now. They got all the billfish, except for swordfish. They got marlin, sailfish, redfish. I'm sure is a recreational fish. Tarpon, snook, bonefish, all that's recreational. Do they really have to catch these Goliaths? There should be plenty of other stuff if managed properly where they don't have to. And if they really want to do a catch and release, they just limit it to shallow water like the Everglades and small fish and circle hooks, not the big ones in the spawning aggregation. It's just stupid. And they do that at a Palm Beach all the time. They have these special charters to go out and catch these monster fish. Right where the same people that are diving that have paid a lot of money and come halfway around the world to photograph and see. They've got these other clowns from Palm Beach catching them, doing their catch and release right in front of them. It's a conflict. And Walt's got plenty of photos of them with hooks in them and their eyes bugged out, whatnot. What happens when they're gut hooked? The fish if you got a huge hook sticking through your gut, you're not going to eat. Anything they do eat, they're constantly trying to regurgitate. And you can see them, they just get skinny over time. And they die. Catch and release does not mean zero mortality. That's for sure. They're not saving the world by catching these fish for research. They're just killing.
You definitely bring up quite a few profound points. A lot of this discussion has kind of centered around Goliath Grouper, but I would definitely imagine the same principles apply to really any fish, right? Any deep water fish at least. As someone as someone that has worked kind of both sides of the coin, right? You're a conservationist, but you're also a commercial fisherman. How do we find that middle point? Where is that middle point?
The middle point?
Yeah, between allowing fishermen to money in their pockets and conservation.
I think Goliath Grouper should be the first fish set aside as like one of those iconic species that you don't fish for. Like eagle rays are like that. So are manta rays. And Goliath Grouper should be the first real fish type fish set aside for viewing only. I don't see any way for it to be sustainable. Well, it's not. It's heading back down again. We're seeing less and less on the Bay Honda Bridge, and Walt Stearns is seeing less off Jupiter. The reef data shows less. It's heading south again. The adults.
But then, like I said, right? I mean, that's the case for Goliath Grouper. Like I said, I imagine a lot of the same issues you mentioned have to do with, also, correlate with a lot of these kind of deep water fish too. The red groupers, etc. I mean, do you think the same principle? Do you think there's more of a middle path for those types of species that are more kind of commercially, recreationally kind of utilized? Does that make sense?
I think one thing is to have large areas of the ocean set aside as no fishing, big reserves, and then let people fish outside of it with year-round with reasonable restrictions. That would be one thing, but try to get a little bit more of the ocean closed off and everybody screams. And it seems just to be a no-brainer for a lot of other countries. When they find a spawning aggregation, the first thing they do is protect it. That's the goose that laid the golden egg. Even back, the ancient Hawaiians knew the value of protecting spawning aggregations. But we don't seem to get it here. Not at all. Not in America.
I wonder what's going to be that peaking point where there's no point of return. Once you get those fish extinct, I feel like the way that we're doing it, we're moving from one species to the next, to the next, to
That's
the next.
exactly what we're doing.
Something.
That's exactly what we're doing. Before, we just, like off of Tampa in those areas, you just red snapper and Gag Grouper. That was the two main fish. And then as those got down, we started catching amberjacks, selling them. Now they're even selling barracudas. So it's you just move from one species to the next. Pretty soon we're getting to that point now. Even the barracuda are getting scarce. Whoever thought people would be eating barracudas in the States?
Yeah, the interesting part was we spoke to some fishermen, and one thing, or captains too, and one thing that they mentioned, if we have to wait and not fish for like an entire year or wait years, we're willing to do it. A couple of them, we're willing to wait and sacrifice. That's their business, lifeblood business,
Yeah.
But they're like, we're willing to do it because we understand now how much, how many fish we actually have around us and the diversity of fishing. And it's those type of sacrifices, that they're willing to put a stop. But I don't know. That's like telling somebody switch professions, when all your life you've done this, what else do you do? So it's not a simple solution. And remember, a lot of this is $1 million industry, millions and millions, billions of dollars involved in here.
So is the dive industry. There's been studies done on the Goliath Grouper. They're worth a lot more alive than dead. So what is your point?
Oh, I guess the point is
looking strictly at economics, it's diving. That's the big money maker on these fish. People come from all over the world to see them because this is the last place you can really reliably see them. So that's not a valid argument.
Yeah, it's like I think like I said, it's a really tough position, right? Because it's like this idea that the idea of forcing somebody to switch from fishing to tourism, right? That's not something you can force on anybody. But from what it seems like the reality is going to be is that it's going to have to be a transition. Something's going to have to give. Either the first is that it's either we adapt, we switch our economic kind of systems up a little bit, or we can just wait until everything kind of goes kaput and everything kind of gets destroyed. And in the short term, I just don't see. In the short term, I just don't see anybody budging. I'll be honest with you.
No, I don't either. But they're already killing them, especially up off of Tampa in those areas. They just go out and spear them and kill them. We see them under the Bay Honda Bridge with spears in them all the time. So it's even completely protected people are still taking them, and the population is going down. So what do you think is going to happen if you reopen them? Probably going to go down even quicker.
All right, so I think that's it in terms. Actually, one last three last questions. How do you define conservation? I mean, what does conservation mean to you, and what does sustainability mean to you?
What is conservation to me?
Yeah, and sustainability.
And to what?
Sustainability.
Oh, well, I mean, conservation, I think, is, leaving some for tomorrow. But that doesn't seem to be, acceptable with FWC. And, sustainability, I suppose, is, using something at a wise level where it replenishes itself. But again, it's its attitude of, nobody saved any buffalo for me. And the attitude of a lot of South Florida, sadly, when looking at the resource, is anything in general, really, is if you can't eat it, sell it, or fuck it, what good is it? That's the attitude. And how you're not going to educate these people. You're not going to compromise with them. It just ain't going to happen.
And I guess final question to anybody that's listening, right? Kind of, what are your kind of final thoughts to the world? Any last kind of statements you want to make to the audience?
I don't know. Better start wising up to how you use this resource, or it's not going to be much left soon, real soon.
Absolutely, and I think with that concludes the interview. I really appreciate your time, Captain Maria.
Okay.
Your insight was incredibly valuable, and it was such a pleasure to interview you and your daughter as well.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, man.
All right.